July 15th, 1945. Somewhere in Soviet-occupied Germany, Harry Truman sat alone in his private rail car, watching the devastation roll past his window. Bombed-out cities, rubble where towns used to be, refugees wandering the roads with everything they owned on their backs. This was Stalin's domain now. Truman was heading to Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, to meet Joseph Stalin for the first time. He had been president of the United States for exactly 94 days. Before that, he'd been vice president for only 82 days. Franklin Roosevelt had kept him completely in the dark about everything. Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project building an atomic bomb. He didn't know what Roosevelt had promised Stalin at Yalta about Eastern Europe. He didn't know the details of any diplomatic agreements. Now he was supposed to negotiate with the most dangerous man in Europe, a man who controlled 100 million people, a man whose army occupied half the continent, a man who had already broken every promise made at Yalta. Truman looked down at the briefing papers on his desk. They were terrifying. By July 1945, Stalin controlled Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany. Soviet forces had also moved into Austria, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland. Nearly 100 million Europeans lived under Soviet military occupation, and Stalin showed no intention of withdrawing. His forces were systematically installing communist governments in every country they occupied. Democratic resistance leaders were being arrested. Elections were being rigged. Opposition politicians were disappearing. The pattern was unmistakable. Stalin was building a buffer zone of satellite states completely under Soviet control. Truman's advisors had warned him. This was just the beginning. If Stalin wasn't stopped now, he would keep pushing west. France and Italy had large communist parties. If Western Europe's economy collapsed, those parties could take power through elections. Stalin could dominate all of Europe without firing another shot. The train slowed. Truman looked out the window. Soviet soldiers lined the tracks, standing at attention. Their uniforms were worn, their faces hard. These were the men who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, the men who had lost 27 million countrymen, the men who now occupied half of Europe. Truman straightened his tie. In less than 48 hours, he would sit across a table from their leader. And he had no idea if he was ready. Stalin's Europe was a prison the size of a continent. In Poland, the pattern was already established. The Polish government in exile in London had led the resistance against the Nazis for 6 years. They had organized the Warsaw Uprising. They had fought and died for their country's freedom. Stalin arrested them. On March 27, 1945, 16 Polish resistance leaders accepted an invitation to meet with Soviet officials. They were promised safe conduct. When they arrived, the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, arrested them all. They were taken to Moscow, put on trial for terrorism, and sentenced to prison. The leaders who had fought the Nazis were now in Soviet cells. Stalin replaced them with Polish communists who had spent the war in Moscow. Men who owed everything to Stalin. Men who would do exactly what Moscow ordered. The same pattern was playing out in Romania. King Michael had switched sides in August 1944, joining the Allies against Germany. The Romanian army had fought alongside Soviet forces to push the Germans out. Stalin's response was to install a communist government anyway. On March 6, 1945, Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky arrived in Bucharest. He demanded King Michael appoint a communist prime minister. When the king hesitated, Vyshinsky slammed his fist on a table so hard the wood cracked. He gave the king 2 hours to comply. The king complied. In Bulgaria, the pattern repeated. In Hungary, it repeated. In Czechoslovakia, the only democracy in Eastern Europe before the war, communist agents were infiltrating the government, preparing for a takeover. This was the reality Truman was walking into. Stalin didn't negotiate in good faith. He negotiated from positions of strength, and in July 1945, strength meant Red Army divisions occupying half of Europe. Truman's advisors had prepared him as best they could. Secretary of State James Burns was a tough negotiator from South Carolina. He had been at Yalta with Roosevelt. He knew how Stalin operated. Burns told Truman, "Stalin respects firmness. He exploits weakness. If you give an inch, he'll take a mile. If you show strength, he'll probe somewhere else." But there was a problem. Truman needed Stalin's help. Japan hadn't surrendered yet. The invasion of the Japanese home islands was planned for November 1945. Truman's military advisors estimated American casualties could reach 500,000. The fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown how fiercely the Japanese would defend their homeland. If Stalin entered the war against Japan, Soviet forces could attack Japanese positions in Manchuria and Korea. It would force Japan to fight on multiple fronts. It would save American lives. So Truman needed Stalin's cooperation. But Stalin knew Truman needed him, which meant Stalin held the leverage, or so it seemed. July 16, 1945, first day of the conference. Truman was in his quarters at the Little White House, a villa in Babelsberg, near Potsdam. He was preparing for the first plenary session when an aide handed him a telegram. It was from Secretary of War Henry Stimson in Washington. The message was coded. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. Truman read it twice. Then he understood. Operated meant the test had happened. Diagnosis meant the weapon's yield. The atomic bomb test in New Mexico had succeeded. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, just hours earlier, the Trinity test had detonated the most powerful weapon in human history. The explosion was visible from 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the sky. The heat was so intense, it turned sand into glass. Scientists at Los Alamos calculated the yield was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, a single bomb, the power of an entire bombing raid. Truman sat down heavily. The weight of what this meant settled on him like a physical force. He had been negotiating from a position of weakness. Stalin controlled half of Europe with the Red Army. Truman had threats and moral arguments. Now Truman had something Stalin didn't, a weapon that could destroy entire cities. The military implications were obvious. If the bomb worked against Japan, the invasion wouldn't be necessary. American soldiers wouldn't have to storm Japanese beaches. Hundreds of thousands of American lives would be saved. But there were also diplomatic implications. Truman now had leverage Stalin couldn't match. The United States possessed the ultimate weapon, and Stalin would have to take that into account during negotiations. Truman called in Burns and showed him the telegram. Burns read it and looked up, his face carefully neutral. "This changes everything," Burns said quietly. "Does it?" Truman asked. "Stalin's already in Poland. The bomb doesn't change that." "No," Burns agreed, "but it changes what happens next. If Stalin knows we have this, maybe he'll think twice about pushing further west." Truman wasn't so sure, but he decided to use the information strategically. He wouldn't tell Stalin directly, not yet. He would wait, see how the negotiations developed. Then, at the right moment, he would mention the new weapon, casually, like it was nothing special, and he would watch Stalin's reaction very carefully. July 17th, 1945. Just before noon, Truman was working at his desk when an aide knocked. "Mr. President, Marshal Stalin has arrived." Truman looked up. Stalin stood in the doorway. He was shorter than Truman expected, about 5 feet 5 inches. His face was pockmarked from childhood smallpox. He wore a simple military uniform with no decorations except a single gold star on his chest. But his eyes, Truman would remember those eyes for the rest of his life. Dark, calculating, missing nothing. Truman stood and walked forward. Stalin extended his hand and smiled. Truman shook it. The grip was firm. They sat down. An interpreter positioned himself between them. Truman decided to be direct. "Marshal Stalin, I'm not a diplomat. I'm used to saying yes or no after hearing both sides of an argument." Stalin's smile widened slightly. Through the interpreter, "I appreciate directness, Mr. President. I have some questions to present. Some issues to discuss." "Fire away," Truman said. Stalin did. The demands were extensive. Massive reparations from Germany, $10 billion minimum. Soviet control over Poland's government and borders. Recognition of communist governments in Eastern Europe. Territorial concessions in the Far East after Japan's defeat. A role in occupying Japan after surrender. Truman listened without interrupting. When Stalin finished, Truman said simply, "We'll need to discuss each of these items carefully." Stalin nodded. Of course. But both men knew what this was. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a poker game. Stalin was showing his cards. Now Truman had to decide which ones to call, which ones to raise, and which ones to fold. That night, Truman wrote in his diary, "I can deal with Stalin. He is honest, but smart as hell. Truman was wrong about the honest part, but he was absolutely right about the smart part. The conference quickly devolved into a series of bitter arguments. The first major fight was about German reparations. Stalin wanted to strip Germany of industrial capacity and ship it to the Soviet Union. The numbers were staggering. Half of all German industrial equipment. Entire factories dismantled and moved east. Machinery, railroad cars, raw materials, everything that could be carried away. The goal was to rebuild Soviet industry, destroyed by the German invasion. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. 1/3 of Soviet wealth was destroyed. Stalin saw German reparations as payment for that destruction. Truman understood Stalin's reasoning. But he also understood history. Harsh reparations after World War I had crippled Germany's economy. That economic devastation had helped Hitler rise to power. Truman wasn't going to make the same mistake. Secretary of State Burns had prepared a counter-proposal. Each occupying power would take reparations only from its own zone. The Soviets could strip their eastern zone. The Americans, British, and French would control the western zones. This would limit how much Stalin could take. It would also divide Germany into separate economic spheres. Stalin rejected this immediately. He wanted access to the industrial Ruhr Valley in the western zones. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland. Coal mines, steel mills, heavy industry. Stalin's eastern zone was primarily agricultural. Without Western industrial equipment, Soviet reparations would be limited. The negotiations bogged down. Every session turned into an argument. Then there was Poland. Stalin demanded that Poland's western border be set at the Oder and Neisse rivers. This would give Poland a massive chunk of German territory. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania would become Polish. 9 million Germans lived in these territories. They would be expelled and relocated into a smaller Germany. Truman objected. These were enormous territorial changes. They should be made in a formal peace treaty, not decided at a conference. Stalin insisted the borders were already settled. Soviet and Polish forces occupied the territory. The Germans had been driven out. It was done. The British were particularly concerned. Most of the expelled Germans would flood into the British occupation zone. Britain would have to feed and house millions of refugees. Stalin was unmoved. Poland had lost territory to the Soviet Union in the east. This was compensation. But Truman understood the real game. If Poland's borders included former German territory, Poland would need Soviet military backing to defend those borders against future German claims. Poland would be permanently tied to the Soviet Union. On July 25th, the conference was interrupted by news from London. Winston Churchill had to return home. British elections had been held on July 5th, but results were delayed to count overseas military votes. The announcement came on July 26th. Churchill's Conservative Party had lost. Clement Attlee's Labour Party won in a landslide. Churchill, who had led Britain through the darkest days of World War II, was out. He returned to Potsdam only to pack his belongings. He had been one of the big three since 1941. Now, he was gone. Attlee arrived to replace him. He was quieter than Churchill, less experienced in dealing with Stalin. The dynamic changed completely. Truman was now the most experienced leader at the table. He had been president for 3 months. Attlee had been prime minister for 3 days. Stalin was the only constant. He sat across the table with the same poker face he had worn for 4 years of wartime conferences. And Stalin knew. Leadership changes created opportunities. New leaders made mistakes. They gave ground to build relationships. Stalin planned to test both of them. July 24th, 1945. End of the plenary session. Truman walked over to where Stalin was standing with his interpreter. He mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Truman watched Stalin's face carefully. He was looking for any reaction: surprise, concern, curiosity. Stalin's expression didn't change, not a twitch. Through the interpreter, Stalin said, "I am glad to hear it. I hope you will make good use of it against the Japanese." That was all. Stalin turned and walked away to confer with his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. Truman was surprised. He had expected Stalin to be shocked, or at least curious, to ask questions about the weapon's capabilities, how it worked, when it would be used. Instead, complete indifference. American officials who witnessed the exchange were equally puzzled. They had anticipated that news of the atomic bomb would give Truman leverage in negotiations. Instead, Stalin acted like Truman had told him about a new type of rifle. Secretary of State Burns wondered if the translator had failed to convey the significance. Maybe Stalin didn't understand what Truman was saying, but Stalin had understood perfectly. Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb. He had known for years. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project at multiple levels. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working at Los Alamos, was passing detailed technical data to Soviet handlers. Fuchs had provided information about the bomb's design, the plutonium production process, the expected yield. David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos, was sending information to the Soviets through his handler, Julius Rosenberg. Theodore Hall, another physicist, was providing independent reports. By July 1945, Soviet scientists had received enough intelligence to begin their own atomic weapons program. Stalin knew the bomb was nearly ready. He knew when the Trinity test was scheduled. He probably knew the results before Truman received the coded telegram. When Truman made his casual announcement at Potsdam, Stalin was simply confirming what Soviet intelligence had already reported. The weapon existed. It worked. Stalin's non-reaction was deliberate. He didn't want to reveal that Soviet intelligence had penetrated America's most secret program. More importantly, Stalin didn't want to show weakness. He refused to be intimidated by American atomic monopoly. That night, Stalin called in Soviet nuclear physicist Igor Kurchatov. He told him, "We must accelerate our program. The Americans must not remain the only nuclear power." The arms race had begun. By late July, the conference was grinding to a halt. Stalin had mastered the art of diplomatic delay. Every proposal required study by committees. Every decision needed days of consultation with Moscow. Truman wrote to his wife, Bess, "The conference is at a standstill because of Uncle Joe's indisposition." But Truman suspected Stalin was stalling deliberately. And he was right. Stalin's negotiating strategy was patience. He already controlled Eastern Europe with military force. Time was on his side. The longer negotiations dragged on, the more permanent Soviet occupation would become. Communist governments were being installed while diplomats argued over procedures. In his private diary, Truman vented his frustration. The Russian soldiers behaved like looters. They had been thoroughly looted by the Germans over and over again. The question was how to break the stalemate. Finally, on August 1st, 1945, the Big Three reached agreements. Nobody was satisfied. On reparations, each power would extract compensation from its own occupation zone. The Soviets would receive 25% of industrial equipment from Western zones, 10% free, 15% in exchange for food and raw materials. This was far less than Stalin wanted, but more than Truman wanted to give. On Poland's borders, the conference recognized the Oder-Neisse line as Poland's western boundary, but officially temporary, pending a peace treaty. Stalin had gotten his territorial changes. Truman had gotten his diplomatic language about temporary status. On Germany, the country would be divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin would also be divided, despite being deep inside the Soviet zone. The agreement called for Germany's complete demilitarization and denazification, but the vagueness of these agreements meant both sides could interpret them differently. Democratic elections in Poland meant free elections to Truman. It meant Soviet-approved outcomes to Stalin. Germany's temporary division became permanent. The 4 occupation zones became 2 separate countries by 1949. The Potsdam Conference established patterns that would define the next 45 years. Stalin had tested Truman and found he wouldn't back down completely. Truman had tested Stalin and discovered atomic weapons didn't intimidate him. The bomb gave America military superiority, but not diplomatic leverage. Truman returned to Washington, convinced that firmness was the only policy Stalin respected. Accommodation would be seen as weakness and exploited. Stalin returned to Moscow, convinced the Americans would resist Soviet expansion, but wouldn't risk war to reverse it. The atomic bomb was a threat, but not an immediate one. On August 6, 1945, 5 days after Potsdam ended, Truman used the weapon Stalin had pretended not to care about. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was destroyed. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. But a new war had already begun. Stalin ordered Soviet scientists to accelerate their atomic weapons program. He told Kurchatov, "The Americans will not remain the only nuclear power." The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949. The American atomic monopoly lasted 4 years. Truman's atomic leverage at Potsdam had been temporary. Stalin's patience had been strategic. The arms race had begun before most Americans realized it. Potsdam taught Truman what kind of leader Stalin was. Roosevelt had tried to charm Stalin at Yalta, treating him like a partner who could be won over with personal friendship. Truman tried to intimidate Stalin with the atomic bomb, showing strength through superior weapons. Neither worked. Stalin couldn't be charmed. He couldn't be intimidated. He pursued Soviet interests regardless of personal relationships or American weapons. He respected strength and exploited weakness. But most importantly, he was patient. Stalin understood something that took Truman months to learn. In 1945, the Soviet Union didn't need to win diplomatic victories. It just needed to hold what it already had. The Red Army occupied half of Europe. Communist governments were being installed. Elections were being rigged. While Truman argued about temporary borders and democratic elections, Stalin was making permanent changes on the ground. By the time Truman realized peace with Stalin was impossible, it was too late to save Eastern Europe. But it wasn't too late to save Western Europe. History vindicated Truman's refusal to give Stalin everything he wanted. The division of Germany into occupation zones prevented Soviet control of all of Germany. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe into a prosperous, democratic bulwark. NATO contained Soviet expansion for 40 years. The Cold War wasn't just about ideology. It was born in that conference room at Potsdam. It was the moment Truman realized that peace with Stalin was impossible, and that containment was the only choice. When Truman's train crossed back into the American sector on August 2, 1945, he looked out at the same devastated landscape he had seen 2 weeks earlier. But now he understood what he was looking at, not the end of a war, the beginning of one. A war that would last 45 years. A war that started the day a haberdasher from Missouri sat across from a dictator from Georgia and refused to blink.